Good morning, everybody. Finally, for those of you who have watched all of the earlier videos, finally I'm going to get into the specifics of step one. Um, for for sponsors or therapists or counselors who are helping people exit their addictions into a more spiritual lifestyle, it's important to bear in mind a couple of things. And if you've been sober for a little while and you're struggling with your sobriety and you're looking to go back and start the steps over again, you need to bear a couple of things in mind. The first thing is that one of the puzzling aspects of addiction in the way that we look at it is that it's more of a spontaneous phenomenon. A phenomenon is something that appears and appears real to us, but we can't really understand the source or the cause. And that's a lot of the reason that hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent on analyzing molecular structure, analyzing body, analyzing trauma, analyzing family systems theory, trying to figure out how an addiction shows up. Can we predict it? And generally, with the information we have now, we can't. It's a phenomenon. We may analyze trauma in childhood. An addiction may show up in a teenager, it may not show up. We may analyze the surrounding relationship circumstances, and nobody's sure when an addiction will actually manifest itself. Sometimes it shows up in teenagers, sometimes it doesn't show up in adults until they're 35 or 40. Sometimes it shows up as a food addiction, or sometimes it shows up as an alcohol or a drug addiction or a sex addiction, a relationship addiction. So nobody's sure of when it will appear. Nobody's sure of how long it will last. Some people go through an addiction that lasts a few years and they manage to successfully stop it on their own. Other people, it lasts longer and they need help. Nobody's sure how long it will last. Some people are involved in their addiction until they die. And nobody can predict how intense it's going to be. There was a lot of, I think, misinformation and confusion in the 1980s when we started to try and draw parallels between the amount of family shame or the amount of family dysfunction and the intensity of addiction. And over the years, I did various little surveys in the seminars I did. And if you came from a really dysfunctional family, that may tend to put you on the spectrum of addiction. But nobody can predict if it will or not, and nobody can predict whether or not the trauma will result in an intense addiction or what kind of an addiction. Nobody can predict how long it's going to last. So all of the prediction schemes leave a lot to be desired. The second thing is that to understand that if you're an addict, it is your personality. You cannot separate your personality from your addiction. Always remember that people who enter addiction are living with a mental mindset of repetitive inadequacy. And this is especially true in the abstinence not available addictions like food or sex or relationships, where addicts will make a commitment in their mind that they're not going to do it again, and 3 days later they're acting out. Or alcoholics or drug addicts or sex addicts will go to treatment and they make a sincere commitment in treatment, and then 30 days after they're out, they relapse. They frequently make commitments to stay in relationships in the end. They frequently make commitments to complete their work projects or to show up on time or to be more responsible, and they fail. This repetitive failure leaves them with a deep-seated sense of that maybe life isn't for them and there's no point in trying. And this sets up a kind of cognitive dissonance where the addict may think in their mind that they know that their drinking or drug use or using pornography is unhealthy, but then they find themselves acting out. This is especially common in smokers who know in the back of their mind that smoking is bad, and yet they go in the store and buy cigarettes. And that creates an internal sense of shame. And or you'll know, the person knows that buying prostitutes or spending hundreds of dollars cruising the singles bars or spending 12 hours a day surfing on the internet. They know that this is somehow unhealthy or wrong, and they make a commitment to not do it, and then they do it again. That sets up an internal cycle of shame. And as I've talked about, the shame comes from one of three sources. It comes from the socially imposed shame that addicts are bad and sinners. It comes from um, the, the shame of the addict in the way that they act out and fail and act out and fail. They feel ashamed of their behavior. And some shame comes from early family systems. So there needs to be a sense of balance and intelligent inquiry into understanding shame and cognitive dissonance. And remember that addiction always lives in flawed relationships. And that's not necessarily an attack on parents or caregivers or teachers. According to the parents or the teachers, the caregivers, they may be conducting themselves with integrity. The sense of flawed relationship is what appears in the mind of the addict, that they can't trust anybody, that they're doomed to failure, that nobody cares about them, that nobody can help. And in all of this, remember that when an addict relapses or an addict goes to treatment and they fail and they act out or they relapse, they, as I said earlier, they promise their spouse that they're going to come home right after work and they show up 3 days later. Remember that at the time the addict made the commitment to do something better, to do something responsible, to show up on time, the majority of the time they were sincere in making the commitment. And when an addict wakes up hungover or broke or in jail or fired from their job, it's very often just as puzzling to them. So the intention of an addict to do good things is often sincere. It's their addiction that gets in the way, and they can't really explain it. And so to the observer, to the counselor, to the therapist, it appears like the addict is being defiant or belligerent or not paying attention, which largely isn't true. They are paying attention. The addict is paying attention, and the addict has good intentions. It's their addiction that gets in the way, not their sincerity. So, because of this, because of a repetitive inadequacy, because of cognitive dissonance, because of the failure of good intentions, it's very important in the first little while of recovery, certainly the first year, to avoid complicated analysis of situations with the addict. Asking the addict to disclose or talk about complicated family systems theory or the complicated systems theory of addictions or is always dangerous and sets them up for more failure. I have supervised in a treatment center one time where newcomers with 2 or 3 weeks of sobriety or had just newly come from detox were admitted to the treatment center on Monday. On Tuesday, they were given like a 15-page questionnaire on their family history. Did your mommy like your daddy, and did you ever have sex with animals, and did you ever have sex with your siblings, and were you sexually abused, and how many times did you fail at school? And all of these questions are inappropriate unless the addict has some considerable time of sobriety under their belt, and these questions are discussed in therapy with an exceptionally well qualified therapist. And I don't mean qualified therapist like they've got a master's degree. I mean a qualified therapist who has a specific amount of education about addictions, about how to conduct therapy, and understands the nuances of the way an addict thinks. So, addiction is a complicated psychology. And one of the things that makes it complicated is there is a certain collusion and an avoided responsibility by politicians and government and religious organizations and society where They claim interest, but actually display indifference. And they talk about addiction being an illness, but then the person who is an addict has to fall down on their knees and declare that they're a sinner in moral guilt. All of these things are complicated, so it has to be kept very simple. And it requires a very delicate unraveling process in a very specific way. And that's one of the brilliant things that Bill Wilson got when he wrote the 12 Steps. In the psychology of recovery, it's very important to be delicate and patient and explore the recovery process in the way that it's outlined in the psychology of the 12 steps. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So while all this is going on in early recovery, as the addict is approaching sort of the initial phase of responsibility, be mindful of polyaddictions. I've talked about that before. There's always 2 or 3 addictions, minimum of 3 addictions going on. One of them is always relationship addiction. And that's going to set up a complex dynamic between the addict in recovery and the person who is helping them. Because the addict will try and create relationship dysfunction because that's all they know. So the therapist or the sponsor has to be aware of this so that they can avoid that sort of complex dynamic of relationship addiction, polyaddictions. The second thing is that very often anybody that's early in recovery with an addiction has noticeable sort of intimacy and sex problems and confusion. Now, that's not necessarily confusion about choice, or it's not confusion about identity. It's confusion about how to go about talking about it and feeling ashamed when you do it and reverting to power struggles in the expression of sexuality. And remember that romance, sex, and relationship addiction are integrated addictions. And then there's always the whole dynamic that I talked about abstinence available and abstinence not available addictions. Abstinence available, gambling, tobacco, alcohol, drugs. Abstinence not available, sort of internet use, cell phone use, relationships, shopping, spending, sex, that kind of a thing. So all of this needs to be borne in mind as we're approaching step 1 and this first sort of effort at recovery. So if you read that handout that I gave you called How Recovery Works, the Psychology of the Path, it should be in the handouts that you downloaded from my website. If you haven't got them, you want to get them now, and you go to www.greenroomlectures.ca. And there's a link on the menu, there's a link to the free downloads. Download them, print them off. So you've got this handout in there that's called How Recovery Works, the Psychology of the Path. And in that, I outline in the sort of the 12-step process what the psychology of each step is. And that's independent of whether or not you have a higher power or you don't, or you're an atheist. The psychology of the steps must be accomplished regardless of whether you believe or don't believe. And the first step is we admitted we were powerless over addiction, that our lives had become unmanageable. Now, in the step, in the middle of that, there is a dash. We admitted we were powerless over our addiction, dash, that our lives had become unmanageable. That dash is a specific piece of grammar. It should not be a comma, and it should not be an and. If you're approaching step 1, and the step you are reading is, we admitted we were powerless over our addiction and our lives had become unmanageable, that's a setup for failure. If there's a comma in there, we admitted we were powerless over our addiction, comma, that our lives had become unmanageable. There's failure in there too. And that's a rather complicated process that I explain in the Green Book, Spiritual Transformation. It's a dash. And so what that piece of grammar means is the words or the phrase that follows the dash, in this case, that our lives had become unmanageable, is a different way of explaining what went before the dash. So the second half of that step after the dash is actually an explanation in different words. So, we admitted we were powerless over our addiction is the same thing as saying that our lives had become unmanageable. And it's really important to understand that, because if you split it into two parts, step one is not in two parts. And if you think step one is in two parts, you're creating a whole lot of unnecessary problems. It's a kind of a setup for failure. So, the first thing to understand is that step one is not in two parts. We admitted we were powerless over our addiction, that our lives had become unmanageable. And that requires a certain level of rigorous honesty, and I've talked about rigorous honesty quite a bit. If you're not willing to be rigorously honest, then this path will fail. It won't work. So, when you're doing step one, understand that is not in two parts. The second thing to understand that's a setup for failure is that with some determination, the newcomer has to, what I call, stop jumping around. There are newcomers that will, well, I can think of a couple of clients I've had over the years where they're going to Alcoholics Anonymous, they're going to Narcotics Anonymous, they're going to a church, they're seeking advice from their AA sponsor, their NA sponsor, they're seeking advice and religious guidance from a minister or a priest, and they're going to therapy once every 2 or 3 months, getting advice from a therapist or a psychiatrist or somebody. And in all of this chaos and confusion, they're not getting any specific information on what they need to do. So it's very important to stop jumping around. Find someone that you trust, find someone that is reasonably knowledgeable about addiction, and stick with them. Now, what is it that you have to do, or what is it that you have to accomplish? Well, the first thing is the whole process of recovery starts from the inside out. Okay? This is an inside game. And so the first thing you have to do in recovery is recognize that this whole thing about addiction and acting out and this obsessive compulsive self-destructive mindset is something that lives in your personality. So, all of recovery, all the way through to the end of the trip, after step 12 and into a spiritual lifestyle, all the way through this, it's an inside game, and it doesn't depend on anybody else. It may depend on you getting wise advice from a therapist or a sponsor, but it isn't dependent on the participation of anyone else in your life. It's an inside game. And all of recovery is a thing that's where you're committed to rigorous honesty. So what you have to do, and one of the things I found is quite helpful, is, hope I don't sound like I'm contradicting myself, is you get a copy of 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, which is the AA reference book. And in that, there's a chapter called Step 1. And it's only about 2.5 pages. It's fairly short. What I would encourage you to do is to get a copy of that, and then on a separate piece of paper, in your own handwriting, read the first sentence of the chapter in the book, and then write that down in your own words on the piece of paper. And then read the second sentence and try and personalize it. Take that second sentence and read it and understand it, and then write it on the piece of paper in your own words. And you do that all the way through the full chapter on how it works. So what you're going to end up with is 2 or 3 pages of handwriting in your handwriting, which will be your way of saying in your words what Bill Wilson was trying to teach us in the step 1 in the reference text. And the point of doing that is to personalize it. You need to take the information in that step 1 and you need to personalize it in your words so that the step, the awareness, the teaching, or the knowledge is personal to you. It has to be personalized. And that relates back to the thing that I've talked about where you have to become the director of your own treatment. You have to understand your own personality. As you're going through this, remember that one of the expressions in the Alcoholics Anonymous literature is that what's necessary is willingness, patience, and labor. Now, certainly your intention is good and you're willing to do this, but the two things that are overlooked are patience and labor. Patience, you have to learn to take your time. Labor, you have to actually go out and buy a pad of paper and get a pen and get a copy of that step 1 from 12 Steps and 12 Traditions and take 2 or 3 hours and write it out in your own words. It has to be personalized. Then, on another piece of paper, now this is written in the Green Book, by the way, in some detail. On a second piece of paper, or at the top of the page, write the name of somebody that's significant in your life. Make a list of 25 or 30 people that are significant in your life at this time and put their name at the top of a page. So it might be mom on one page, and then dad on another page, and then your sister on another page, and then your brother on another page, and then your best friend on another page, and then the last 3 boyfriends or girlfriends you had on the next 3 pages. What I want you to do is to get 25 or 30 pages with a significant person's name at the top of the page. And then, thinking very carefully, starting at page 1, where it says, Mom, I want you to write down 5 lies that you told Mom about your drinking or acting out of your life. And then you go to the next page, and that's Dad. And I want you to write down 5 lies that you told Dad. And then you're going to go to the next page, and the next page, and the next page. And for all of these 30 people, you're going to write down the lies that you told them so that you could excuse your drinking or your acting out. Now, that may be your best friend. It may be the minister that you speak to. It may be the sponsor that you had the last time you were around. The point of this is to understand the crucial importance of being rigorously honest in your recovery. And the only way you can understand how crucial importance is to understand that when you were drinking or acting out or using pornography, how you were an inveterate liar. I mean, as I was when I was in my addiction all those years ago. We have to drive home the realization, we have to really come to terms with the fact that we were notoriously dishonest everywhere in our life. And that's the point of writing down the names of 30 people that are significant in your life, and then writing down 5 lies that you told each person. And so when you're done, you're going to have 140 or 150 lies that you told everybody that was significant in your life. Your teachers, your friend, the scoutmaster, the minister, everybody in your family, your grandparents, your best friend, the people you work with. 25 or 30 people, 5 lies you told each person. We have to learn how nasty we are in our dishonesty. Now, this is to create, the whole point of this is to create a responsible new awareness of our history. Like, what was our history? Well, we were irresponsible and we lied and we manipulated people to justify our acting out. The point of writing out the Alcoholics Anonymous version of step 1, the point of writing it out in your own words is to personalize it so it makes sense to you. Bill Wilson's words about what he thought addiction was in 1939 is only a very, very general guideline. And we each need to personalize it. So do that. Write down a list of 25 people and how you lied to each of them. You'll understand then that your addiction grows out of broken relationships. That's why we're in the mess we're in. And there's a couple of other things. First, recognize that it's not a selfish program. You'll hear that story in 12-step meetings a lot. It's not a selfish program. You hear things like, don't make any big decisions for the first year. That's bad advice, because we can't be in charge of what decisions we're forced to make. And actually making a decision to recover and be sober is a big decision. You hear things like step one is in two parts. It isn't. Stay away from that. And if you want an explanation of the problems that arise out of that, then the Green Book, Spiritual Transformation, has an explanation of that. Don't confuse an unmanageable life with a life you don't like. What you'll find is after you've maintained a little bit of sobriety, your life kind of gets manageable. You'll start showing up for appointments on time. You'll start showing up at meetings on time. You'll start, whatever little bit of money you have, you maybe start being more financially responsible. Now, you may not like your life. You may be living in a recovery house and the food's too salty and your roommate snores, but your life is generally manageable. So try not to confuse an unmanageable life, which means you're in your addiction, with a life you don't like, which is in early recovery. Remember that an addiction is a disease of isolation, and the purpose of doing those two exercises about rewriting step one and admitting your lies is to understand that isolation, how you pushed yourself away from people by your own behavior. You will be feeling ashamed, you will be feeling guilty, you will be feeling like you're a failure and can't do it. These are conversations that you have with the people who are supporting you, the people that are more intimate in your life, your caregivers. Remember that when you're in active addiction, it's ever increasing and permanent pain. And if you choose to get recovered, that means intense pain at the beginning and it gradually reduces. So what you actually do is you maintain your abstinence absolutely. Demand of yourself gently increasing levels of honesty. Don't gossip and don't tell a whole lot of shameful stories about yourself. Those are stories that are best for the person you're choosing to trust with your recovery. Be thorough and painstaking. Remember, willingness, patience, and labor. Certainly you're willing, even though you're reluctant. You have to be patient. This is a long, slow process. Your life will gradually get better. And it's the labor of actually doing the work. I think that's all for step one. If you can do those things, write it out, personalize it, take responsibility for it, recognize how dishonest you are, and make a thorough commitment to remaining abstinence, either bottom line behavior or sobriety from alcohol, drugs, or gambling. If you can do that, and then just sit in that for about 6 months, and learn how to be sober, learn how to enjoy your sobriety a little bit, you will be just fine, and that will accomplish step one. All of this is explained in some detail in the Green Book. There's a lot of psychology in the Blue Book about step one, and I just take a look at that here. I think that's about it. Yeah. And remember that the new version of step one that I've written and put in the book is, we admitted we were powerless over addiction, that our life had become unmanageable. One is an explanation of the other. Take the pressure off yourself. And when you do that, if you can do all that, and you manage to stay sober, I'm looking for something here. I gotta find it. Not yet. There it is. I've talked a lot about spiritual principles. And if you can do this in the way I'm talking about, you will be teaching yourself a little bit about spiritual principles. Principle 1, rigorous honesty. Or Principle 1, don't harm yourself or others. Principle 2, rigorous honesty. And Principle 5, responsibility. That's what you learn in doing step 1. You learn more about stopping harming yourself and others. You learn about rigorous honesty, and you learn about taking responsibility. So even though spiritual principles are way off in the future somewhere, by doing step one, you're teaching yourself that. So that's enough about step one to keep you going. Um, Sometime later today, I will try and get around to doing the video on step two. So thank you and kind regards.